On the morning of the 14th of June 2021, the air around Crater Lake softened like a familiar greeting to the crew starting their new shift. None of them knew that within minutes, they would be staring at a mystery Oregon had waited 18 years to understand. The hum of the excavator blended with the wind sweeping across the lake, steady and ordinary, until the operator felt an unusual resistance beneath the soil. He stopped, leaned forward, and sensed a kind of dread he couldn't quite name. James Peterson, the project manager, hurried to the edge of the pit. He had worked in construction for nearly 2 decades, fluent in steel, concrete, and earth. But in that moment, when he saw a patch of rusted blue metal emerging from the mud, he knew he was looking at something that did not belong to this site. Something that did not belong to 2021. A car. And not just any car. It was a piece of the painful history this community had once tried to bury. James crouched down. When sunlight hit the dirt-stained license plate, his breath caught. He had seen those numbers before on old missing posters across Portland years ago. The blue Honda Civic. The car a 16-year-old girl had been driving the morning she vanished. A chill ran down James's spine. He spoke only one sentence, but it was enough to stop the entire crew. "We need to call the police right now." Within minutes, the noisy job site fell into a strange silence, as if the ground itself was guarding the secrets it had hidden for nearly 2 decades. Every gaze fixed on the mud-buried car. And though no one said it aloud, everyone felt the same thing. Somewhere, a family, a father, a mother had spent 18 years holding on to the fragile hope that their daughter might still come home. Forensics hadn't arrived yet, no conclusions had been made, but everyone understood. This was no longer a simple accident. This was the beginning of a story the entire state believed had already faded into the past. A story about faith, loss, and the kind of darkness that knows how to stand very close to the light. When James Peterson's call reached the Oregon State Police, the atmosphere at the work site changed instantly. What had begun as a routine morning shift was now the potential scene of a case buried for nearly 2 decades. The workers stood in small clusters, silently watching the Honda Civic being lifted from the earth, mud streaking across the windshield, glinting under the sun. No one said a word, but their eyes said everything. Each person understood they were witnessing a truth someone had tried very hard to hide. A truth that might carry the broken heart of a family who had never healed. The first patrol car arrived, then a second. Yellow tape went up around the area. The construction site transformed into a crime scene within minutes. Radio chatter. Hurried footsteps on gravel. And the wind, rolling across the lake, blended with the tightening tension in the air. Detective James Harlow, the first to arrive, crouched to look through the mud-blurred window. He wasn't the type to get shaken easily, but even he paused when he saw the license plate. The forensic team arrived soon after. The white suit stepping out of the van brought a feeling that was both clinical and strangely hopeful. They didn't just bring equipment. They brought the possibility that the truth might finally be called by its rightful name. One technician tapped gently at the dried mud on the car door. Every movement was precise, deliberate, as though they were handling something sacred and fragile. And in a sense, they were. This was the last place where a young girl's memory still lived. When the car door was pried open using specialized tools, no one breathed too hard. A mix of damp soil and aging metal drifted out, carrying the feeling of time compressed. Inside, the vehicle no longer resembled a car. It felt like a time capsule, preserving what had been left behind on one fateful day. The technicians collected strands of hair on the seat, strange dust on the steering wheel, hardened mud particles along the dashboard. Every tiny detail might be a missing piece of the picture Oregon had tried to complete for years. A forensic specialist climbed into the back seat and connected a device to the car's built-in GPS. Most older systems lose data after so long, but when the old screen flickered to life, everyone froze. It still worked. A soft exhale moved through the air like a prayer being answered. A line appeared. Last location recorded. As the coordinates loaded, one technician leaned closer. The address wasn't a forest, not a lakeside trail, not any known route Lauren had taken. It was a house. A specific, intact address that had existed for 20 years without ever appearing on anyone's radar. And when cross-checked with the old case files, the silence grew heavy. 2847 Lakeside Drive, the home of Coach Michael Reed. No one offered a theory. No one made a single assumption. But just as the Earth had tried to hide its secret, the Civic's GPS now whispered the truth it had guarded for 18 years. Forensics moved on to the steering wheel and found trace sweat patterns that had crystallized over time. Everything was carefully sealed into coated tubes. These samples would enter a laboratory far more advanced than anything available in 2003. Technology now could do what had once been impossible. As the car was covered and prepared for transport, Detective Harlow stood watching it for a long moment. He wasn't thinking about the case file, or the press, or the reports waiting to be written. He thought about the father who had lived each day in silence. The mother who once sat beside this lake every weekend until her heart could no longer bear it. He thought of those who had given up, and those who never forgot. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself, almost to the still water stretching out before him. Maybe, after all this time, the 18th of October, 2003, began like any other Saturday morning in the suburbs outside Portland. The crisp autumn air slipped beneath the eaves of every house, and the last streetlights faded as the first rays of sunlight crawled over bright red maple leaves. Inside the Davis family's small home, the alarm rang at 5:15. That sound, so ordinary at the time, would become the noise Karen Davis heard in her dreams for years. She remembered watching her daughter reach out to turn it off, rub her eyes, and step out of bed. Everything was gentle, part of a routine no one ever imagined would never repeat again. Lauren walked downstairs. Karen was in the kitchen making coffee, her hair loosely tied back, her face still soft with early morning fatigue. She looked at her daughter, and a flicker of unease passed through her small but unmistakable. Lauren drank a glass of orange juice, slipped on a light jacket, and lifted her training bag over her shoulder. Karen asked if she wanted company. Lauren smiled a smile Karen would later cling to with everything she had left. She said no. It was just a private technique session, and she would be home before 8. American families who raise athletes often lean heavily on independence and trust. Parents trust schedules, trust coaches, trust that their children are inside a safe, structured system. Karen wanted to believe that too. Yet when Lauren stepped outside, Karen followed her to the door, calling after her. "Call me when you're done. I love you." Lauren smiled, nodded, and faded into the pale morning light. Lauren backed the familiar blue Civic out of the driveway. A neighbor's security camera captured the moment. Her expression was calm, focused, with no sign of worry or hesitation. A 16-year-old girl, disciplined, ambitious, standing right at the doorstep of her Olympic dreams. Investigative records note that the Civic left the Davis home at 5:26 a.m. 7 minutes later, it passed the main road leading toward the Crater Lake Swimming Academy. When the car entered the parking lot, an aging building camera recorded Lauren climbing out, adjusting her jacket strap against the cold. No other cars were there. No other students, just the warm glow of lights inside the academy, as if someone were already waiting. In the original investigative report, the window between 5:47 and 6 a.m. sits as a void 13 minutes that cannot be accounted for. 13 minutes during which Lauren vanished from the world. No calls, no phone pings, no witnesses. A silence long enough to force Oregon to ask one of the hardest questions it had ever faced. What happened during those 13 minutes? What happened during those 13 minutes? That morning, Karen waited for her daughter to return. The clock struck 8, then 8:15, then 8:30. Karen called Lauren. The phone was off. She began pacing the kitchen, gripping a mug of now cold coffee. Thomas, her husband, told her not to worry. Kids sometimes stay longer. But when the clock hit 9 and her fourth call still didn't connect, a cold wave of fear spread through her. Thomas drove to the academy. The parking lot was empty. The building locked. No sign of Lauren or anyone else. Lauren had disappeared, quite literally. The missing person report was filed at 10:15 a.m. Police recorded the basics: name, age, height. Her outfit that morning: the blue Civic, license plate MHD 8734. But what could not be written on any form was the pain that began rooting itself in the Davis family's life. Karen cried from the first question. Thomas stayed composed, but his eyes could not hide fear splintering beneath the surface. From that moment forward, the case of Lauren Davis wasn't just a file. It became a nightmare that gripped an entire community. A story Portland residents repeated for years, always with the same hope that one day the silence would finally answer back. To understand why the disappearance of Lauren Davis broke Oregon's heart, you have to return to her earliest years. Lauren was born on a warm April morning in 1987 at Providence Street Vincent Hospital in Portland. Karen Davis, then a gentle and devoted elementary school teacher, loved to say that Lauren came into the world with a cry as soft as wind. Thomas Davis, who worked at the docks, never forgot the moment he held his first child happiness. She was their only child, and for the young couple, every future seemed to begin with her. Their home sat in a quiet neighborhood in northeast Portland. Summer evenings meant neighbors chatting on their porches, children running across the open lawns, and the warm, close-knit rhythm of the Pacific Northwest. Lauren grew up surrounded by that sense of belonging, a place where everyone knew each other's names, where weekend barbecues were tradition, and backyard baseball nights were filled with laughter. When Lauren turned 4, Karen signed her up for swimming lessons at the community center. She didn't expect anything special, just wanted her daughter to stay safe around the many rivers and lakes of Oregon. But everything changed on the very first day. Lauren wasn't afraid of the water. She didn't hesitate or tense up like the other children. She moved into the blue pool as if it had been waiting for her. This child belongs to the water. Don't ever forget that. Dorothy was right. Lauren progressed so quickly, she nearly outgrew the beginner program in months. At 8, she won 3 gold medals at the statewide youth swim meet. Those medals hung on the living room wall not as decorations, but as reminders that their daughter was stepping into a future they hadn't fully prepared themselves for. At 10, she was accepted into the Crater Lake Swimming Academy, one of the most respected training programs in the Pacific Northwest. For Oregon families, that academy was the birthplace of swimmers who dreamed of carrying the American flag into the world arena. For the Davis family, it also meant sacrifice. Karen woke at 4:30 every morning to prepare Lauren's snacks. Thomas drove her to the lake, regardless of weather. Their life revolved around training schedules, weekend meets, nutrition, and recovery. But what kept them going wasn't the Olympic dream, it was the joy on Lauren's face every time she burst out of the water. Some evenings she sat at the kitchen table doing homework, hair still damp, eyes bright as she told her mother she'd shaved off a few fractions of a second on her flip turn. Karen would smile and smooth her hair. She didn't understand the technique, but she understood passion. By 15, Lauren was one of the Academy's rising stars. Coaches began using phrases like Olympic material when describing her. For many families, that was praise. For the Davises, it was a reminder of responsibility. They just wanted their daughter to pursue what she loved and stay safe. But in elite sports, especially in America, where a young athlete's success often becomes the hope of an entire community, pressure sometimes becomes inevitable. Even so, Lauren wasn't someone who buckled under pressure. She worked hard, maintained excellent grades, was polite, empathetic, and made others feel seen. Friends said she lit up the training facility when she walked in. Coaches said she had the discipline of an adult athlete. And her family believed that no matter what Lauren achieved, the most important thing was that she always kept her kind heart. Perhaps that is why, when Lauren vanished, the pain didn't belong only to the Davis family. It belonged to everyone. A young talent, a good-hearted daughter, a symbol of hope. Her disappearance wasn't just a missing person case, it was a loss. And for 18 years, Oregon never truly healed from it. To understand why the disappearance of Lauren Davis broke Oregon's heart, you have to return to her earliest years. Lauren was born on a warm. To understand the shock Oregon felt when Michael Reed's name surfaced in the GPS data in 2021, one must remember who he once was in the eyes of the community. Long before he became a suspect, Reed was the picture-perfect example of an American coach, dedicated, disciplined, and deeply respected. Tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly groomed gray hair. He walked the halls of the Crater Lake Swimming Academy as if it were his second home. Parents admired him. Students respected him. And anyone meeting him for the first time tended to say the same thing. He looks like someone you can trust. Reed was born in 1,953 inches, Salem, Oregon, and raised in a working-class family. He showed promise in swimming early on, becoming a hometown hero by the time he reached high school. Old-timers still talk about the cheers that echoed in that small-town pool the day young Michael qualified for the 1976 Montreal Olympics. He brought home a bronze medal, but in Oregon's memory, he was a champion long before that podium finish. When his athletic career ended, Reed returned home and began coaching. That was when the legend of Coach Reed truly took shape. Over the next 2 decades, Reed produced state champions, national qualifiers, and athletes who went further than their families had ever imagined. Parents said he had an eye for talent, an instinct to sense what a child could become, and the skills to shape them into disciplined competitors. He stood poolside from dawn to dusk, clipboard in hand, scanning every movement with laser focus. When a student excelled, he gave a small approving nod, barely noticeable, but powerful enough to make a child beam. When they faltered, he rested a hand on their shoulder and reminded them that every great athlete falls before they rise. In American sports culture, especially in small communities, coaches are often given enormous trust. A coach is more than an instructor. They become a guide, a mentor, a guardian of a child's future. To the Davis family, Reed was the keeper of Lauren's dream. To Lauren herself, he was the path forward. The one who told her the Olympics weren't a distant fantasy. He called her champion, and Lauren believed him with all her heart. But every story about Reed carried one unmistakable trait. He was devoted, yet strangely private. He never married, never lived near relatives, rarely joined team gatherings. Students only knew him in the pool. Parents only interacted with him at meetings or drop-offs. Whenever someone tried to learn more about his personal life, Reed simply smiled and changed the subject. Some former coaches later described Reed's training style as disciplined to the point of obsession. He demanded perfection. Even from students who lacked exceptional talent, he expected more than most would consider reasonable. Outside it, he vanished into the quiet silhouette of his Tahoe as soon as practice ended. Those shadows weren't enough to raise suspicion at the time. Reed's privacy was interpreted as focus, his rigidity as normal in a competitive sport. And sometimes, a community will believe what it wants to believe, rather than see what stands quietly in front of it. Still, those who worked with Reed remembered one thing clearly: he paid special attention to students he believed could reach the national stage. Lauren was one of them. He gave her more encouragement, more time, more mentoring than others. He told her parents she could go far. With other students, his smile was faint. With Lauren, he always used that same word, champion, placing on her both pride and an invisible weight. After Lauren disappeared, Reed attended every search effort. He placed a hand on Thomas Davis's shoulder and said Lauren was too disciplined to skip practice. His voice trembled slightly on live television as he called her the best athlete he had ever coached. Long after the public's memory faded, Reed continued teaching for nearly another decade before retiring. No one questioned him. People saw the grief on his face and believed he too was a victim of loss. But behind the veneer of excellence lay a truth only he knew, a shadow no one could see through medals or morning practices. 18 years later, when the Civic's GPS lit up with a single set of coordinates, Reed's polished image began to fracture. A small crack, but enough for investigators to realize what they had missed all along. Sometimes, the darkness isn't lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, it stands right next to the starting block, where every eye looks toward it with absolute trust. The morning of the 18th of October, 2003 began with the familiar sound of an alarm ringing in Lauren's small bedroom. The clock read 5:15 a.m. Outside her window, Portland was still wrapped in the blue-gray light of early autumn. Lauren reached over to silence the alarm, rubbed her eyes, and sat up. She had done this thousands of times before, yet no one knew this would be the last. Downstairs, Karen Davis was making coffee. The quiet aroma drifted through the kitchen, blending into the stillness that often fills the homes of early rising American families. She checked the time, then glanced toward the stairs. Lauren always came down right after her alarm, and that morning was no different. But when Lauren stepped into the kitchen, Karen noticed something in her daughter's expression that made her hesitate. Maybe the focus of a young athlete before an important session. But to a mother, even the smallest difference can turn into an unspoken thread of worry. Lauren took a glass of orange juice and sat at the table. Karen asked if she was sure these early private training sessions were safe. Lauren smiled, reassuring her. She said Coach Reed wanted to check her new flip turn technique. Just a one-on-one practice. She'd be home early. Later, she would say it felt as if her heart was trying to warn her, but she didn't know what it was warning her of. Lauren grabbed her jacket, zipped her training bag, and paused when her mother called out. Lauren turned back with a bright, clear smile one Karen would hold on to like a sacred memory and said, "I know, Mom. I'll be home before 8. Lauren left the house at 5:26 a.m. It was the last image the community ever had of her alive. The road to the Crater Lake Swimming Academy was nearly empty that morning. Oregon autumns are cold but beautiful. With bright red maples forming a natural tunnel, Lauren had driven that route hundreds of times, and no one imagined it would become her final one. When she pulled into the parking lot at 5:47, the Academy's camera recorded it. The footage was dim, but clear enough to show her stepping out, adjusting her training bag, and breathing in the cold. No other cars, no other students, just the glow from inside the building, as if someone were waiting. Lauren walked into the lobby. The door closed behind her. It's the kind of moment that makes any parent's heart tighten when they watch it back, because from that point on, Lauren never exits through the front doors again. According to a staff member who remembered seeing Reed that morning, he arrived earlier than usual. He stood inside, waiting for Lauren with a smile she believed was encouragement. But in truth, it meant something else. Something no one recognized at the time. Reed told her he wanted to move the session somewhere quieter so she could focus better. And she trusted him. In the U. And Lauren was someone who trusted the adults leading her. The rear entrance camera was not working that morning, or that was something Reed knew perfectly well. No footage shows Lauren leaving the building through that door. But later, cell tower data revealed her phone signal shifting toward Lakeside Drive only minutes after she stepped into the lobby. That morning, Karen rinsed her coffee cup, glanced at the clock, and reminded herself her daughter was practicing living another ordinary morning in the life of a young athlete. She couldn't have known that around that same time, Lauren was leaving the academy with the one person her family trusted most. The moment Lauren met Reed inside that empty building became the crossing point between the bright light of her dreams and the shadow of a truth Oregon would need nearly 2 decades to uncover. And while her Civic sat silently in the lot cold, still, untouched, no one realized the only thing disappearing from that morning was the future of a young girl. When investigators look back on the case today, one detail continues to haunt many of the younger detectives who later studied it. 13 short, vanishingly small minutes between the moment she walked into the Crater Lake Swimming Academy and the moment her phone signal disappeared forever. 13 minutes that, if understood correctly at the time, might have saved an entire life. But 2003 was not the age of advanced technology. It was a time when even a minor error in data interpretation could send an entire investigation down the wrong path. After Lauren entered the building at 5:47 a.m., no camera ever captured her again. She never appeared walking back out the front doors. There was no footage of her running outside. No sign of her Civic leaving the parking lot. The only trace she left behind was a single cell tower ping, an extremely brief, faint signal that appeared at a tower located a few blocks away in the direction of Lakeside Drive. Timestamped. The signal lasted only seconds before going silent. In 2003, that kind of blip was dismissed as interference, not a meaningful clue. And it's something making the content. But in 2021, when analysts re-examined the data with modern tools, that blip became the compass that finally cracked the case. Specialists recognized the curvature of the signal strength, the overlap patterns, and the directional drift, all of which indicated Lauren's phone had moved away from the academy almost immediately, meaning within 5 minutes of entering the building, Lauren was no longer there. She had left, not alone, not in her own car, and most importantly, she left in the exact direction of Coach Reed's home. At the time, investigators did not consider the cell tower data important. They focused instead on searching around the lake, the woods, and the roads where they believed Lauren might have become lost or injured. They never considered that she had been taken somewhere else entirely. Certainly not to Lakeside Drive, a quiet strip of homes tucked beneath tall pines, where the only sounds were birds and the soft splash of oars on the water. One of the most consequential errors in the original investigation was the level of trust placed in Reed. Detectives did not view him as a suspect. His reputation as the model coach overshadowed any possibility of wrongdoing. Witnesses said Reed had no reason to harm Lauren. Parents insisted he cared deeply for his students. Local news portrayed him as a man devastated by the loss of a promising young athlete. And Reed himself, in a televised interview, said Lauren was the best swimmer he had ever coached. His trembling voice convinced Oregon he was a grieving mentor, not someone who might have held crucial information back. But no one questioned the most obvious detail. If Reed was the last person scheduled to meet Lauren that morning, why didn't he report anything unusual? Why did he tell investigators she never showed up when the camera clearly recorded her walking inside? That contradiction should have been the first red flag. But in real life, the signs are not always recognized when they matter most. When the data was reanalyzed in 2021, experts noticed something the old technology completely missed. The brief signal from Lauren's phone was not just a ping, it matched the pattern of a device being manually powered off, a type of signal fluctuation that occurs only when a human physically turns the phone off during movement, not a malfunction. Combined with the missing camera footage, the stationary Civic still sitting in the lot, and the directional movement toward Reed's neighborhood, everything pointed to the same conclusion. Lauren did not leave the academy in her own vehicle, and if she didn't leave in her own car, there was only one possibility left. She left in the car of someone waiting for her inside the building. This should have prompted investigators to ask the difficult questions. Why was a coach at the facility so early on a weekend? Why did he insist on a private session before sunrise? Why didn't he follow the academy's usual protocols? But in 2003, those questions were deemed unnecessary because the community believed a simpler story, that Lauren had gotten disoriented, that she might have wandered off, that an accident had occurred. These mistakes were not due to incompetence, they were due to human nature. People tend to trust what they think they know. In the American youth sports world especially, trust in coaches is so deeply rooted that it can overshadow truths that should have been seen. The most painful part is this. If the 552 signal had been analyzed correctly, the direction toward Lakeside Drive would have been enough to narrow the search. A search there could have led to Reed's home, could have uncovered early evidence, perhaps clothing or personal items, something left behind. And if that had happened, 18 years of grief might have been shortened. The history of the Lauren Davis case is the history of small details forming a massive tragedy. A broken rear door camera, blind trust in a respected coach, Cell tower data dismissed as noise. Each factor became a stone placed perfectly to build the wall separating the Davis family from the truth. Later, when Detective Harlow reviewed the reconstructed signal map from 552, he stood in silence. He said the distance was only a few blocks. A distance Lauren could have run in minutes. A distance so small that any investigator might wonder, if they had followed that path sooner, they might have found her. Not in 2021. Not too late. That moment when the signal disappeared was not just the end of Lauren's journey. It was a bitter reminder that sometimes the truth isn't hidden in grand mysteries. It is buried in small details that no one looked at long enough. When Lauren's missing person report was filed on the morning of the 18th of October 2003, the entire community around Crater Lake shifted almost instantly into emergency mode. A missing 16-year-old was never something Oregon took lightly, a state known for its tight-knit towns and strong volunteer spirit. Oregon State Police, local SAR teams, and dozens of volunteers quickly converged around the academy. They brought maps, flashlights, radios, and above all, the fragile hope that Lauren had simply wandered off and could be found. In the first critical hours, the K-9 units were deployed. The search dogs, trained specifically for missing person cases, tracked Lauren's scent inside the academy building. This led investigators to conclude that Lauren had left the area by vehicle, not on foot. But because her Civic still sat untouched in the parking lot, they assumed she had either gotten into a familiar car or been coaxed away by someone she knew. Regardless of the theory, the search teams had to begin with the most familiar terrain, the forest paths. Searchers spread out in horizontal grids. Her name echoed through the cold October wind carried far, but never answered. SAR units deployed a spiral search tactic based on the assumption that Lauren might have slipped, wandered, or fallen somewhere near the lake. Teams were assigned expanding radii, first 500 meters, then 1,000. They checked every footpath, every brush pile, every rocky ledge. Overhead, helicopters soared for hours, infrared cameras scanning the ground inch by inch. But nothing surfaced. No trace of Lauren. No signs of a struggle. No scattered belongings. The only known piece of the puzzle remained the Civic. And when the only clue leads nowhere, a search becomes as directionless as the mist drifting across Crater Lake. Meanwhile, divers were brought to the shoreline. Crater Lake is infamous for its depth, its clarity, and its freezing temperatures. For hours, teams of divers descended into the dark blue water, searching for any sign of the Civic, hoping it had slid into the lake and could be recovered. But the lake bed was eerily undisturbed. No tire marks. No metal glints, no shattered glass. After 3 days, the underwater search wound down, because there was no evidence, none that the car found 18 years later had ever been in the lake. The heartbreaking truth is that the entire SAR operation was built on a false assumption. Investigators focused too heavily on the possibility that Lauren had left on her own or been injured nearby, instead of asking the harder question, why did Reed claim she never arrived? When the camera clearly showed the opposite, one wrong assumption led to a flawed search strategy. No one expanded the search toward residential streets, especially not toward Lakeside Drive. As news spread through the community, hundreds of volunteers joined. Some had never met Lauren, but carried her photo door to door, asking if anyone had seen her. An elderly woman from a nearby town said she joined because she once had a granddaughter Lauren's age. A man from the lumber mill skipped his entire shift. He said he couldn't stand the thought of that family suffering alone. The search became more than a mission. It became a shared moral duty. Yet no one imagined that Lauren might have been taken away from the area immediately. No one questioned the only other person who was at the academy that morning. The person who should have been the first to report anything unusual was the same person who subtly guided the narrative. Reed told police Lauren never showed up. Parents believed him. Police saw no reason to push further. And when trust is placed in the wrong person, every investigative path bends out of shape. Search teams didn't know they were looking for a girl who was no longer anywhere near the lake. As for the Civic, finding it in 2003 was nearly impossible. There were no tire marks, no sign of the car leaving the lot, No broken glass or debris pointing to movement. Once a car is buried by heavy construction machinery, the surface naturally levels out, leaving no visible clues above ground. And because everyone believed the Civic was still in the parking lot, no one considered searching beneath layers of earth near the old club site. No one asked whether the ground around the academy had been disturbed overnight. After a week, hope began to dim. Prayer circles formed at the local church. Candles were lit each evening in front of Lawrence High School. Teammates pinned handwritten letters to the swim team bulletin board. Karen and Thomas Davis joined every search effort, walking slower each day, their faces more exhausted, but refusing to give up. A mother holds on to hope the way she holds on to the last edge of a cliff. As winter approached, the search was suspended for lack of leads. Police concluded there was not enough evidence to classify the case as an abduction. This became one of the deepest wounds, not because law enforcement failed to try, but because they relied on incomplete data and a flawed assumption. They never knew that Lauren's Civic sat intact beneath the earth only a few hundred meters away, buried with answers Oregon would not uncover for 18 years. Looking back, the search for Lauren stands as proof that sometimes even the greatest human effort cannot overcome what human eyes fail to see. And in Lauren Davis's case, what they didn't see was the very thing that mattered most. Time can heal many things, but for the Davis family, it only widened the wound. In the first days after Lauren disappeared, Karen and Thomas tried to keep life as normal as possible. But in a home once filled with the laughter of a 16-year-old girl, silence slowly became the most haunting sound. Every morning, Karen found herself looking toward the stairs, as if waiting for Lauren to walk down. Every night, Thomas paused outside his daughter's room, resting his hand on the doorframe as though opening the door might somehow reveal her sitting at her desk under the warm yellow light. But that moment never came. In the first months, they survived on hope. Hope that police would uncover something. Hope that Lauren was being held somewhere and would eventually be found. Hope that one morning, a call would come telling them they could finally bring their daughter home. Karen clung to every rumor, every vague sighting, every stranger who claimed they had seen a girl who looked like Lauren. Thomas tried to keep the family from collapsing into despair, but the silence surrounding Lauren's disappearance hollowed him out in ways he couldn't express. That difference, not a lack of love, slowly fractured them. In 2005, 2 years after Lauren vanished, their marriage could no longer withstand the strain. No one judged them. The community understood that some losses are so large they cannot be carried together. Karen moved into a small apartment near Portland. Thomas stayed in the old house. Each kept a different part of Lauren's memory. Her mother kept the photos and the hopeful but misguided letters people mailed in. Her father kept the bedroom intact and Lauren's hoodie hanging on the hook behind the door, as if waiting to be worn on a cold morning. Neighbors said Karen often visited Crater Lake on Saturday mornings. She sat on an old wooden bench by the water, holding a picture of Lauren, staring across the still surface of the lake. She believed, somehow, that Lauren was still nearby. No one had the heart to tell her that the search had been suspended. No one wanted to extinguish the tiny flame of hope she carried. Thomas, on the other hand, grew quieter. He drowned himself in work, drove the same routes Lauren once took. But he didn't talk about her often. Whenever he tried, his voice broke, and he was afraid that if he started crying, he would never stop. Meanwhile, Reed continued living a life no one could have imagined. Still coached as if nothing had ever happened. To the community, it was the image of a dedicated coach grieving the loss of a talented athlete. In reality, it was the perfect way to hide. He continued giving interviews every year at the memorial ceremony, saying things that brought tears to the eyes of anyone listening. He called Lauren the light of the academy, said she could have made the country proud, said he thought of her every time he looked out over the calm lake. Those words convinced people that Reed, too, was hurting. And a man who is hurting does not fit the picture of someone who could have caused it. That assumption settled deep into Oregon's consciousness. In America, people tend to sympathize with figures who appear burdened, especially coaches and teachers' roles associated with responsibility and trust. That trust, unintentionally, built the perfect shield around Reed. In the years that followed, he retired and lived quietly in his home near the water. His days passed with morning walks and tending to the small garden behind his house. No one on that peaceful street knew they were living next to the man who had inflicted nearly 2 decades of pain on Oregon. No one questioned why his eyes seemed a little too calm in every interview about the student he claimed to have loved like family. Time continued. Each year, on the anniversary of Lauren's disappearance, the community lit candles and placed flowers outside the academy. But attendance dwindled. Tragedy, when stretched across years, often becomes something people learn to live around. Yet the emptiness remained, especially for Thomas. He kept Lauren's photo in his wallet for 18 years, opening it whenever he needed to remind himself that he once had something more beautiful than anything the world could offer. Karen never lived to see the truth uncovered. In 2019, she passed away after a heart attack. Her closest friend said her final words, whispered just before she slipped away, were, "Find Lauren. Don't let my girl disappear forever." She carried that longing into eternity, a longing no one could fill. And through all those years, Reed lived with a peace that only the guilty could ever fully enjoy. But peace does not last, because the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the light. And on a June morning in 2021, when the Civic was pulled from the earth, the silence of 18 years finally began to crack. On the day the Honda Civic was lifted from the ground, every investigator on the Oregon team understood the magnitude of what they were witnessing. A case nearly 2 decades old, frozen in cold case files, worn thin in the community's memory, and etched painfully into the Davis family's heart, had suddenly stirred back to life. Justice, in its strange way, doesn't always return with fanfare. Sometimes it comes back in the form of a clump of soil falling from an old car frame, a bit of dust, a strand of hair, a trace of dried sweat. When the Civic arrived at the Oregon State Crime Lab, the atmosphere inside was nothing like a routine examination. The technicians knew that every sample they touched was part of the final story of a girl whose name they had grown up hearing. A few of them admitted later that they remembered the posters taped to telephone poles when they were children. So when the lab doors closed, they weren't just doing forensic work. They were paying a debt to time. Modern forensics in 2021 is nothing like what existed in 2003. Evidence once considered useless could now become the key to everything. Sweat residue on the steering wheel, dirt particles on the dashboard, organic material that had remained untouched for 18 years. All of it was scanned under specialized fluorescence, then broken down into DNA molecules. Technicians collected microsamples with ultrafine swabs, sealing each one into coated glass tubes. When placed into the analyzer, the machine hummed softly, a steady rhythm, like the slow reawakening of justice after a long sleep. Just hours later, the preliminary result appeared. A DNA profile that did not belong to Lauren. A profile that repeated in multiple locations. On the steering wheel, the gear shift, and inside the glove compartment. The team reran the tests to rule out contamination. There was none. The DNA did not fade, did not shift, and did not lie. When the system cross-matched it with the criminal database, a name appeared in under a second. Michael Andrew Reed. A name no one wanted to see. A name everyone had believed could never be involved. A name the community had trusted for years. For Detective Harlow, reading Reed's name felt like a blade of cold steel sliding through his chest. He sat quietly before the screen, saying nothing, not because he was shocked, but because he was thinking of the Davis family. And now Harlow would have to carry that answer to a quiet home where only memories of Lauren remained. While the DNA pointed to the culprit, the Civic's GPS delivered a second undeniable blow. Primitive as it was, the system had preserved its final location. Not the forest, not the lake, not any of the areas previously searched. A single, specific address, 2847 Lakeside Drive, Reed's home. With modern analysis, experts also determined the exact timestamp of that data, 5:52 a.m. matching perfectly with the moment Lauren's phone signal vanished. When DNA and GPS were combined into a single reconstruction, the truth became painfully clear. Lauren never left the academy in her own car. She left in Reed's. Her phone was manually powered off, and the Civic was buried near the academy that same night. Every warning sign missed in 2003 had now crystallized into evidence no one could dispute. During the first internal briefing, the room fell silent for almost a full minute before anyone spoke. Not because they doubted the science, but because they were processing the weight of what it meant. A swim coach once held up as the embodiment of integrity had concealed his crime for nearly 20 years. A man calm enough to attend every memorial. Calm enough to put his hand on Lauren's father's shoulder. Calm enough to mourn a tragedy he himself had created. As Harlow looked again at an old photo of Lauren, he realized the final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place. No more uncertainty. No more theories. No more errors. Technology had done what humans could not do in 2003. It had given Lauren her voice back, a voice buried beneath the earth, muffled by time, but finally heard. The next morning, Harlow signed the arrest warrant. And he knew that when he walked up to Reed's front door, he would not just be carrying a pair of handcuffs. He would be carrying 18 years of a father's waiting, 18 years of a mother's grief, and 18 years of silence. Finally shattered by the truth, when Detective Harlow and the officers walked up to the door of 2847 Lakeside Drive on the morning of the 20th of July 2021, the Oregon sky was unusually clear. No one spoke on the drive over. It felt as though each man was bracing for a moment the last 18 years had been circling around. And when Reed opened the door, the thing that struck Harlow was not surprise. It was the utter absence of it. Michael Reed, once the most beloved coach at Crater Lake Academy, stood in the doorway with silver hair and a calm, almost serene face. No protest, no denial. When Harlow read the arrest warrant, Reed simply bowed his head, nodding lightly as if hearing something he had expected for a very long time. The door closed behind him, and the click of the handcuffs echoed through the quiet house like the final punctuation to 20 years of pretending. In the interrogation room, the white overhead light cast stark shadows across Reed's features. A cold metal table stood between him and the investigators. Reed sat upright, hands loosely clasped, no trembling, no anger, just the exhausted stillness of a man who had lived too long between two worlds. Harlow placed a photograph of Lauren in front of him. The 16-year-old in her blue swim team suit. Strong, radiant, full of promise. A picture thousands had seen, yet only Reed knew how her story had truly ended. He stared at the photo for a long time before speaking. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. I knew this day would come, not because you found me, but because I couldn't carry it anymore. The room fell silent. It wasn't the voice of a man fighting for innocence. It was the voice of someone who had lost to himself years ago. When Harlow asked why he did it, Reed didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes, searching for words to describe what he had spent 2 decades running from. I felt something for her. Something I knew was wrong. I thought I could control it. But that morning, when she walked in alone, when I saw the way she looked at me cautious, I knew I didn't have control anymore. This was the moment criminal psychologists call the fracture point, the instant where the boundary between thought and action dissolves. He was not a man overcome by sudden violence. His crime was born from a quiet obsession. A distorted attachment hidden beneath the calm, disciplined exterior everyone trusted. Predators like Reed do not lurk in the shadows. They live in plain sight among neighbors, among colleagues, among families who believe they are safe. As Reed recounted the events of that morning, Harlow felt a surreal heaviness. Reed's voice never wavered. He described each step, how he led Lauren out of the building, how he lied to her to get her into his vehicle, how everything unraveled within minutes. When Harlow asked why he buried the Civic, Reed replied, I didn't want anyone to find it. But deep down, I think part of me wanted to be caught. I wanted someone to end this for me. I wanted someone to end this for me. It wasn't remorse, not truly. It was fatigue. The psychological collapse of a man who no longer knew the difference between guilt and routine. Reed had lived 18 years as the respected former coach, but that persona could never erase what he had carried underneath. When the interrogation ended, Harlow walked out of the room with a weight he could not shake. He took no comfort in the confession. No admission of guilt could bring Lauren back. No explanation could return the years stolen from the Davis family. But he knew one thing with certainty. Lauren's story had finally been spoken aloud by the one person who had kept it silent. After 18 years, the truth had a voice. And although that voice was painful, it was the only form of justice the world could now give her. Lauren Davis's funeral was held on a quiet May afternoon in 2022 at Portland Memorial Cemetery. There was no rain, no wind, only a gentle Oregon sky. As if nature itself stepped back to give the family and those who loved her a moment of stillness. On a hill overlooking rows of ancient pine trees, her white casket was placed beside Karen Davis's resting place. After 18 years, mother and daughter were finally side by side again. Hundreds came. Former teammates who once swam lanes with Lauren. Investigators who refused to give up. And even strangers who felt connected to her story, as though they had known her in another lifetime. They stood in a wide circle around the Davis family, holding white flowers and laying them down one by one, each bloom a late goodbye. Thomas Davis stood by his daughter's casket in a black suit. He looked thinner, his hair grayer, but his eyes, those tired, determined eyes, had not changed. They were the eyes of a man who had lived 2 decades caught between hope and despair, now standing face to face with the truth, late but undeniable. When he spoke his farewell, his voice didn't shake. It was low, heavy, and full of love. He said Lauren was the most beautiful thing life had ever given him, that he regretted not being able to protect her, that he hoped Karen, somewhere beyond, had finally embraced Lauren and whispered that the waiting was over. When the casket lowered, many people cried. After nearly 20 years lost in darkness, Lauren had been given back her name, her story, and the truth she deserved. She was no longer a missing person, no longer an unanswered question. She had come home, even if only in silence. And that return meant more than anything. A few months after the funeral, Crater Lake Swimming Academy erected a memorial by the lake where Lauren once trained every morning. It wasn't grand or elaborate, just a small bronze plaque set beside a stone overlooking the water. The inscription read, "Time 10, in time, Lauren Marie Davis, swimming among the stars." Simple words that touched anyone who approached it. Everyone knew Lauren had lived with a dream, and that dream still lingered here, untouched by the darkness that tried to steal it. The Academy also renamed its annual swim meet the Lauren Davis Invitational. Young athletes who learned her story said they wanted to swim harder, faster, in honor of the girl who never had the chance to reach the finish line of her own life. And in some quiet, poetic way, every stroke across that lake became a greeting sent out to Lauren somewhere beyond. What keeps this story alive isn't just the crime. It's the power of community. The power of those who refused to let Lauren's name fade into paperwork. The power of investigators who reopened the case as technology evolved. And the power of a father who carried the memory of his daughter through 18 years without ever letting go. But there is another lesson, a harder one. Trust is precious, but also fragile. Especially when placed in people with authority, influence, and access to children. Lauren's story reminds us that sometimes the monster doesn't hide in the shadows. It stands in front of us, smiling, wearing the face of someone good, someone shaped by the expectations society mistakenly hands them. As the sun set over Crater Lake, where Lauren once swam hundreds of laps, the final rays caught the edge of the memorial plaque, making the inscription glow for a brief moment. She left behind her story as a reminder that justice may come late, but it never disappears. And somewhere in the quiet of Oregon, her name still drifts across the water, through the wind, and in the hearts of those who believe the truth always finds its way back to the light.